On the 29th of January of 2025, a man by the name of Salwan Momika was shot in his home in Sweden during a TikTok livestream. Though the motive and identities of the murderers are not yet known publicly, it is easy to speculate that the people behind this are Muslims who shot him for his blasphemy against Islam. You see, Salwan is best known for burning the Quran as a form of protest against Islam, the Quran being the book that Muslims consider to be holy and the word of God. Obviously, Muslims all over the world were not happy about that, and many called for his death since the first time that he did it. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit more about who he was and the aftermath of all that has happened. My name is Apostate Aladdin. I'm an ex-Muslim and I make videos discussing Islam critically. And today I'll be joined by another ex-Muslim, Alim, aka Secular Spirit, to discuss our thoughts about what happened. Thank you for joining, Alim.
And thank you so much for having me. I wish we were doing this video in better or cheerier circumstances, but this is a really tragic situation and it's been really upsetting seeing what's happened since Momika's death. And I think it's really important to talk about it, so I'm glad we have this opportunity to do that.
So what do we know about what happened?
Well, to be honest with you, when I heard the news, I had never actually heard of Salwan Momika, but I had known that someone had burnt the Quran in Sweden a couple of years ago. And so my first response was that this was an ex-Muslim who was burning the Quran like many other ex-Muslims have done as an act of protest against Islam, and someone came out and punished him. And then I found out that he was actually on trial in Sweden for agitation against an ethnic or national group, and the verdict was to be issued in his trial the day after he was killed. And then I was thinking, so this is probably why it was done at that time, for some sort of strategic propaganda purpose from those who killed him.
Right. But that is all speculation because we still don't know all the facts, unfortunately. We do know that 5 people were arrested for his murder, and then they were set free, even though they are still suspects. So as far as I know, no one is being held for his murder right now, unfortunately. And the Prime Minister of Sweden has revealed that the intelligence services are very much involved in this case because they suspect it could have something to do with foreign powers. Despite not having all the facts yet, it's not beyond question that the people who did this are Muslim, because we have a lot of precedent of violence against critics of Islam. That has happened many, many times. For example, Salman Rushdie, Charlie Hebdo, Samuel Paty, and this sort of thing happens even more commonly in Muslim majority countries. Like, for example, 10 years ago, Farkhunda Malikzada, hundreds of people watched her being killed because she was accused of being a blasphemer, when in fact she was a student of the Quran and Islamic Sharia law. So it's not beyond question that the people who did this were Muslim. All that being said, how did you feel when you first heard this news?
To be honest with you, I felt shocked and afraid because I think, like many people watching, you wouldn't expect that something like that would happen in a country like Sweden, one of the most peaceful, open-minded countries in the world, one that has a growing Muslim minority population now, though. And it made me think about how, even though I'm criticizing Islam from the country I live in, Canada, where it feels safe to do so, it made me think you never really know what might happen to you when you criticize Islam, because there's Muslims in Canada, the US, throughout Europe, and it really takes just one person who has a vendetta against you for something horrible like this to happen. So it's terrifying.
Yeah, same here. When I heard the news, I was sad, anxious, and afraid, not just for myself, but for all the other activists out there who might someday see a similar fate just because someone targeted them and took issue with their criticism of Islam. But the one thing that I was not was surprised, because this has happened many times, as I've said. So unfortunately, despite it being sad news, it's almost expected at this point.
And when I heard about his death, I wanted to learn more about him because it turned out that there were many prominent ex-Muslims who were familiar with him. And that's when I found out that he actually wasn't ex-Muslim. He was a Syrian and he lived in Iraq, and then he moved to Sweden a few years ago. And one of the reasons why he wanted to criticize Islam was because he was living in Iraq during the time period when ISIS was in control of the region of the country that he was living in. That made it make a lot more sense to me. This is with someone who directly experienced the worst possible things that Islamic teachings can create in the world.
There have been reports circulating about his association with the Popular Mobilization Unit, a coalition of mostly Shia militias formed in 2014 to fight the Islamic State organization. And that would make sense. There's even evidence of him in military garb, carrying handguns and so on. And I would assume that this would cause him troubles when he's applying for asylum or when he's immigrating to Europe. So there have been theories that all of what he was doing was partly motivated by his intention to remain in Europe. So he's trying to be as hostile as possible to Islam and Muslims so that, if he has a fatwa issued against him in Iraq, he can't return to Iraq, which is apparently something that has happened. The Swedish immigration authorities renewed his temporary residence permit because of the threat that he would be facing if he returned to Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, in the days after his death, I started learning about all these theories about why he was doing what he was doing, why he was burning the Quran, why he was advocating against Islam. It's worth mentioning that he was, beyond being pro-Sweden and pro-Europe, he was also pro-Israel. And so there's been rumors online that he was a Mossad agent working for Israel. I've seen rumors that he was working for Iran, which kind of doesn't make sense once you learn more about his criticisms of Islam. And I think it's something that he also denied. And then there's people who have just said, oh, well, he was a Christian, so he just hated Muslims. And, oh, he was an Assyrian, so he just hated Arabs. So lots of rumors swimming around. And the other thing I started noticing, and this is the thing that upset me the most, was the shocking lack of empathy from Muslims to his horrible death.
Yeah, so it's no secret that he has a complicated past, and there are a lot of rumors surrounding his intentions and his actions. So I'm not here to assert that one of these theories is correct. I didn't know much about him before this incident, to be honest. Much like you, I just knew that someone in Sweden was burning Qur'ans, and I didn't really pay much attention to it because it doesn't affect or interest me as a form of protest, but we could talk about that in a bit. But then when I started learning more about him, I learned that he was so controversial that he was kicked out of a right-wing political party in Sweden. That's how controversial he was. But I understand that given his experience with Islam and Islamic terrorism, it's no surprise that he would passionately feel about the topic and go to extreme lengths to always get attention for the cause that he believes in. And I definitely don't think that he deserved to die the way that he did or to be punished for burning the Quran. But like you said, unfortunately, in the aftermath, a lot of reactions from Muslims have been gleeful and almost celebrating his death. How does that make you feel to hear that?
Well, my feeling whenever it comes to these sorts of incidents where someone who's a prominent critic of Islam is harmed or is killed, and I saw the same thing when Salman Rushdie, the writer of the Satanic Verses who had the fatwa issued against him, was almost killed recently as well. You'll find that Muslims are sort of divided into three camps, more or less. So there's the group that condemns what happened wholeheartedly, and they'll say, this is not the true Islam. This has nothing to do with Islam I believe in. So that's one group. And then there's the second group that say something along the lines of, well, it's horrible that this thing happened to Momika, but he was burning the Quran and he was insulting Islam, and he kind of got what was coming to him. He shouldn't have been surprised by what happened. And then there's the other group that's the most problematic one, even though I could argue that the second group is also problematic. Maybe the first one too. The group that say, well, he got exactly what he deserved. He offended Islam, he burned the Quran, and his death and suffering is merited, and he's going to also suffer in hell. And so I've seen dehumanizing language calling him a dog in a human shape, for example, or, rejoicing about how he's going to be burning in hell. And it's really alarming that there's a lot of Muslims out there who think that about another human being.
Their thoughts on him going to hell, though they don't actually affect him, though they don't actually manifest into someone going to hell, because as you and I believe, there is no such thing as hell. That being said, the real world effects of such beliefs is still present. So when they dehumanize someone and they assert that they deserve even worse treatment, it's not unlikely that other Muslims might turn such sentiments against other people in this life right now. So yeah, I find that very troubling. And to such Muslims, I say, why is your God so petty? And why is your attitude towards criticism of your God that petty? If God is truly all that you believe him to be, then God is gracious enough to accept any criticism and insult without expecting you to incite violence in his name. If anything, God wouldn't write such a book that is so poorly written and so hateful in some parts of it that does make total sense to burn it as a form of protest. I mean, if we want to get into that, there are very hateful verses in the Quran. Unfortunately, not every Muslim knows that, or not every Muslim pays enough attention to know that. And even when they do, there's nothing that they can do about it because they're forced to accept that it is a perfect book. But if we're going to talk about burning hateful books, I mean, the hadiths, the seerah, the books of fiqh, all of these books, as well as the Quran, are full of hatred and full of violence. So it's understandable that someone would want to burn them. So to those who think that he deserved it, I ask, doesn't the book deserve to be desecrated? Don't we have the right to protest against hate? To those who think that this has nothing to do with Islam, it obviously does, even if it's not the version of Islam that you believe in. There are enough Muslims in the world that do believe in Islam in that way and will take action in that way. But if we look back at what the religious authorities would say, if we were to deal with this Islamically, the person would be punished. He might not be punished in mob violence or, in vigilante justice form of way, but they will be executed. So it's not all that different from what these people are doing all on their own. So in many ways, this is actually real Islam. I understand the reluctance to accept that from a Muslim's point of view because maybe they don't support it at all and they don't want to believe that their God would support such a thing. But the reality is that there are other believers using the same label and the same books to justify horribly violent actions. And that's a reality that Muslims have to face.
The only thing I would add to what you just shared, and I completely agree, is if you're a true believing Muslim and you think that someone who desecrates the Quran and who is a non-believer who rejects Islam is going to go to hell and suffer all these horrific punishments that are detailed in the Quran itself. Is it really that much worse that he was just killed the way he was in this world when he's going to suffer so much worse in the afterlife?
And for the Muslims who do want to distance themselves from acts of violence against burners of the Quran, maybe remember that burning the Quran is actually officially the correct way to dispose of it Islamically. So you could argue that he did nothing wrong by burning the Quran because that's how you dispose of a Quran. That being said, Muslims still have to contend with the fact, and I say fact because they believe in it, that their prophets like Ibrahim and Muhammad destroyed idols of polytheists, idols that didn't belong to them, and they saw that to be completely justified because it was in the name of the truth and was fighting against falsehood and fighting against the corruption of the truth. By the same logic, they have no objection to someone burning their books because they don't find them to be the truth. If anything, this guy burned a book that he owned, not someone else's property, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this whole thing is absurd because how we reached this point where we've had all of these technological advancements, and I would say all these advancements in terms of respecting each other's rights and humanity, and yet something as simple as, let's look at it, it's burning a book. Pages, just paper, is aggravating people to the extent where they'll protest, they'll issue boycotts against other countries, and they'll even kill people for it. How insane is that in this day and age?
And it's very telling that this is the reaction to burning this one particular book. I'm sure if I burned a Bible, Christians wouldn't love that I'm doing that, but I wouldn't be in as much danger as if I burned the Quran. So if you're a believer who gets, an emotional reaction, an angry reaction out of someone doing that, just ask yourselves, why? Why do I need to react to this at all? Just ignore it and move on with your life. That would probably be the best course of action for you. But anyway, what do you think of burning the Quran as a form of protest?
So my personal feeling as an ex-Muslim who sees a lot of harmful things in the Quran and thinks that people shouldn't follow what's in that book at all is that I have always tried to focus my criticisms on actual Islamic teachings, things that would be in the Quran, because when you do something like burning the Quran, I think in the end of the day, that's a stunt. And it will attract attention for sure. And it will, perhaps you could argue, challenge the sacred, can't be wrong, this is complete perfection position that Islam holds in Muslim societies and that it also holds inevitably in Western societies that try to defend Muslims no matter what. So it can challenge that, but at the end of the day, it's a stunt that has no actual substance in of itself. So in a lot of the kinds of things that Salwan Momika was posting, for example, on Islam, I rarely found an actual criticism of Islamic doctrine or teaching. A lot of it was focused on low-hanging fruit in terms of memes criticizing Islam or talking about burning the Quran. And there's nothing that a Muslim can take from that beyond seeing something that offends them and makes them very emotional and defensive. It's really hard to then talk to a Muslim about the problems of Islam when they're in this emotional, supercharged state.
And even for a non-Muslim who wasn't familiar with Islam, when they come across such a publicity stunt and then they go check out what this guy's talking about. I was scrolling through his Twitter, for example, and I saw a post where someone took a video of what seemed to be a homeless person on drugs who might have been Muslim. They seemed to be ethnically Middle Eastern. And somehow he thought that that was an argument that he was making against immigration or against Islam somehow. So his confusion of all of these political causes without actually explaining how they're related or without actually offering any solutions makes it, to me, seem like publicity for the sake of publicity or attention for the sake of it only. So going back to the Muslim's perspective who comes across his actions, it doesn't really get a Muslim to change their mind about Islam. And then the question becomes, who is this for? If this is for attention, whose attention are you trying to grab and what are you trying to say to them? If it's for Muslims' attention, it really fails because it doesn't move things forward in any way. If it's for other people's attention, then all he's saying is Islam is bad and look at how angry Muslims get when I burn the Quran, which is valid in and of itself. But for me as an ex-Muslim, it doesn't really take the cause any further. It doesn't help me in any way.
And to talk a little bit more about what intended audience he has, when I looked at his X or Twitter, I saw him asking questions like, do you support Muslims all being deported back to the Muslim world, to Islamic countries, which resonates with some people that followed him on X. But then if you really think about what the implications of that would be, it would be horrific. It would be horrible. And then also other things like comparing the pictures of Islamic sheikhs to monkeys or chimpanzees. It really made me think, what is his goal here with everything that he's doing? Because it brings up the question of motive. And to clarify again, I don't think any motive merits someone like him being killed for what he's done besides burning the Quran, things he said. But the question of what his objective is important when we look at things like this, because they do create an impact in society.
I'm inclined to believe that there might be truth to the accusations that this is meant to or does incite racial hatred in one way or another, because at the end of the day, he's just peddling simplistic narratives and not really any solutions. And it has happened, unfortunately, that there was recently a mass shooting in Sweden not too long after his death, and it's possibly racially motivated. There's at least one Syrian man who died in that incident, a shooting at a school. So these things do have an effect. You know, this is a cycle of hatred that continues on and on and on. So our objections to burning the Quran isn't necessarily, or isn't at all, because of people's feelings being hurt. It's just from a point of what's the most productive thing to do at this point?
That's a really important question to answer, because obviously the answer isn't just standing by and letting Muslims dictate what can be criticized, what can't be criticized. And it's important to note as well that Momika wasn't the only person who was on trial for burning the Quran. He did have a companion as well who was on trial. And this other individual, his name was also Salwan Najm, was convicted of having expressed contempt for the Muslim ethnic group because of their religious beliefs on 4 occasions. So he's given a suspended sentence and fines for his involvement in the burnings of the Quran and making derogatory remarks. But here's the thing that really blew me away when I was reading about the verdict. The judge presiding over the case said that expressing one's opinion about religion does not give one a free pass to do or say anything and everything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And that was just a shocking thing to hear someone in a European court say. Because what would you take from that if you were to hear it?
What I take from that is that the Muslims who protest in violent ways or actually resort to violence to stop the critics have won to some extent, because they've established that people's feelings are more important than people's freedoms, or more important than criticism of the religion. I don't know what the law says in Sweden explicitly, but I don't think the law is about people's feelings only. So it's really hard for us to know how to feel about any of this, because it's not as simple as this man's a hero or he shouldn't be burning Qur'ans. I don't mind someone burning the Qur'an if then they were going to take it to a more productive place, but unfortunately, based on all that I found on Salwan, he wasn't really going anywhere with it. So despite it being something that angered a lot of people and got a lot of attention, I don't think it's going to improve the situation at all. As I see this getting more and more volatile in Europe and in all other parts of the world as well, from the perspective of someone who does appear to belong to that group that he's calling for their extradition and so on, then we're going to see a lot of instances of hate towards us, even though we're not Muslim. That's from a selfish point of view. That's if I didn't care at all about Muslims. But from a realistic point of view too, There are a lot of Muslims out there that don't know half of what's in their book. There are a lot of Muslims who don't feel the ways that Salwan wants them to feel so that he can then piss them off by burning the Quran. So it's unrealistic to expect all Muslims in the world to react to Islam the way that we want them to react to Islam, or to think of it the way that we want them to think of it. And it's obviously unfair to direct the hatred that is meant for Islam as a doctrine towards all the believers as if they all believe in it and enact it the way that it's supposed to be enacted.
That's exactly true. And that's the other thing that's been concerning me when I think about the lack of empathy I've seen in the last few days. It's not just from Muslims. I've seen some ex-Muslims online saying some very dehumanizing things about Muslims, sometimes calling them vermin or parasites, the ones who may have committed the murder of Momika, but also talking about Muslims in general as this big monolithic group that practices Islam and believes the exact same things about Islam all in the same way. And that's simply not true. And I don't see having that attitude about Muslims of dehumanizing them, even if some of them believe terrible things and have done terrible things. They're still human. I don't see that approach leading to anything improving. I just see it making things worse and putting people more and more in the confines of their own echo chambers.
When you say stuff like that, you'll be accused of being too empathetic towards Muslims because of a sense of belonging, maybe, or because you might have not completely deconstructed from Islam yet. That's the accusation that we usually get. But I can speak for myself, at least, when I say I have empathy for all people. It's not exclusively empathy for Muslims more than others. It's just that I'm more pragmatic about this. What's the solution? How are we progressing closer to a solution? To make things more volatile and either celebrate the man's death or call for more burning of Qur'ans and more pissing off Muslims, it's just not helping me and people like me in any way. So when we talk about things like that, we're not talking about it from the perspective of someone who deeply cares about Muslims only as a group. I care about all people, and Muslims are one of many groups out there that will be affected by all what's happening.
For me, I think it all comes down to connection. How can we build connections with Muslims? Because Islam isn't going to change unless that change comes from within. And when you understand the Muslim mindset as well as we do, because we grew up Muslim, we lived and breathed Islam, when you understand that a lot of Muslims are indoctrinated since childhood, this is all they know, and because of that, their thinking about the entire world and about individuals like Momika is warped. The answer isn't to then just go and dehumanize them, but it's to try and build those connections and remember that they're human beings, even if they believe horrible things, and to try and reach them with your arguments and ideas, to try and explain to them why someone like Momika burning the Quran isn't something that is deserving of death or of hell. That is what the focus should be on. And I think a lot of that has been lost in the stuff I've seen on social media, even from people who are critics of Islam.
You and I are no strangers to blasphemy either. So it's not that we're against blaspheming because it might hurt people's feelings. But I think it's a lot more productive to blaspheme in ways that help deliver the message rather than just get shock value out of your action. I've blasphemed a lot and I continue to blaspheme. And I think the way that I do it has made it so that a lot of Muslims are more receptive to my blasphemy. Even though some might not like it, there are a lot who do listen to it. They do give it a shot, and that does change their mind in one way or another. The end goal is not to get everyone to leave Islam, but even those who remain Muslim, they remain Muslim for a sense of identity or community or obligation or some other reason, and they pick and choose the parts of it that they identify with, and usually that's not a lot of the bad parts in Islam. So when the attack is just very personal against their identity, when burning the Quran makes them feel as if their identity is in danger, and especially when they see a lot of support from groups that do want them out of their homes, they want them out of their countries, it's not out of the question that a Muslim would become more religious or cling on to their identity even harder as a response to that, and maybe even start reading the Quran and start justifying the bad things that are in it, because what other choice do they have? The other side just hates them for existing.
And now I'm just worried about what's going to happen in the aftermath of all of this. For example, I saw on the news that a man in Manchester also burned the Quran, and it's being investigated on if that was linked to Momika or what his motivation was. But it is concerning because will it lead to just this escalating tit-for-tat situation where someone burns the Quran and then someone gets killed over it and then someone burns more Qur'ans and so on and so forth? That's not what we need to be seeing. And the thing that's scary for me as a content creator who criticizes Islam online is, what does that mean for the safety of people like me, the ones who are trying to advocate for, humanism, for equality, for living a life without organized religions that dogmatically say what you should do, and that others who don't believe in your religion are sinners and abominations, or whatever you want to call them. What it means is we have to be careful. We have to be afraid. And my own mother, when she saw the comments from some people who were supportive of Momika's death, when she saw those comments, she's thinking, what if people say that about you one day? What if people are obsessed with you the way they became obsessed to the point where they tracked down where Momika lives and killed him? And I didn't have a good answer for her, because that's always going to be something that's going to be hanging in the background. And I don't see this current climate improving that. It just makes it scarier. It makes it worse. And it makes me think again about if I want to keep doing this, even though I'm doing it anonymously.
Unfortunately, the hostility that you would receive from some believers out there is not always proportional to how nice or how rude you're being. So even though you're nowhere near as rude or as offensive as Salwan is, it's not out of the question that someone might try to hurt you for what you say, even in the nicest ways about Islam. So the point of this video is not to tell people to be nice about their criticism. Not at all. People should be free to criticize Islam and other topics however they see fit. The point is to find which methods resonate with you and to support that and to emulate that. So no matter how rude or aggravating Salwan might have been to some people, none of it justifies killing him or being gleeful about his death. At the same time, just because he did that doesn't mean that you have to regard him as a hero or a martyr, because that's kind of the simplistic religious thinking of how a person can do one thing and it automatically all their sins or all their misgivings are forgiven and they're a hero and they deserve praise for that. I don't view the world that way. I don't think he deserved to die for what he did. And at the same time, I don't view him in high regards. Because if I were to call him a hero or a martyr, then I would have to defend a lot of opinions that I don't hold that he holds. So it's okay to have a nuanced take. It's okay to not support his death, his murder, and at the same time not view him as a bastion of free speech and a hero for us ex-Muslims or critics of Islam. And to wrap up, do you want to tell me what you think of the Quran as someone who probably wouldn't burn it?
Well, I went from being a believer who thought that every word of it was perfection, that it was a conduit to the core of the meaning of life itself, to now seeing it as a relic of a long time ago that has some wisdoms in it, some interesting, if maybe kind of scary stories in it too from history, and also just some very horrible stuff that tries to tell us what to do and what will happen to us if we don't believe. And for anyone who ever reads it, it's also pretty goddamn repetitive, I have to say. We have to remember that this is just a book. It's just words. And we have to think about what in the Muslim mindset is driving people to the point where they would actually kill another human being over this. That's what needs to be tackled more than just burning a Quran. It's that mentality. It's those beliefs.
I think a lot of Muslims think very highly of the Quran without actually knowing what is in it. And they're just in love with the idea of the Quran as they've been taught to believe and think of it. And they have it very deeply ingrained with their identity and purpose in life. And there are a lot of good sentiments that someone can find in Islam or that someone can attribute to Islam or identify with and therefore think that it came from Islam. So I'm not surprised to see Muslims being that attached to the Quran. That being said, it is just a book like any other book that, as far as we know, came from a human source. It's a book that has some good things, it has bad things, and it's not productive and it's not helpful to view it as a perfect book that could not be improved, because there is no such thing as perfection in this world. And if we view the words of a long dead man claiming to speak for God as perfection, then that holds Muslims back, and that causes a lot of friction and a lot of violence and a lot of hate. So yes, the Quran is not a perfect book by any means, but at the same time, I'm not going to burn it because it's not going to help me in any way with my activism. But I just wanted to say that most things are not as simple as they seem. You can condemn the Quran and Islamic terrorism and intimidation without having to burn the Quran yourself. You can dislike Salwan's form of protest without justifying his murder. And you can believe in the Quran and in Islam and hold it near and dear to your heart while recognizing that others might not feel the same way, and they're within their rights to protest it however they feel like it. I hope the message is received.
The other message that I would want to send to everyone watching this is to remember each other's humanity. I know that sounds like this really obvious on-the-nose thing, but when we're thinking about the words that we're using when we're typing out our replies or our comments on YouTube or Instagram or wherever it is, We have to remember that we're talking to another person, unless it's a bot. Whatever they believe in, if they're Muslim or they're driven mad by hatred of Islam for whatever reason, this is a human being and there's reasons why they believe what they believe. And it comes down to those ideas. And that's what we need to tackle instead of seeking to dehumanize the other person that we disagree with.
Well, thank you for your thoughts and thank you for joining me today. Please go check out Secular Spirits channel, subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment. Let us know what you think. Where do you disagree with us? Where do you agree? Leave a comment below. And as always, think critically and think for yourself and consider watching one of these videos next.